The Goodies were one of the biggest British comedy acts of the 70s, from their signature sitcom to the novelty songs that were actually big chart hits. They made a huge impact on British comedy and are fondly remembered by fans to this day. And yet the lack of repeats and home releases saw the show become unfairly obscure as the years wore on. I first became aware of them when a best of DVD was finally released in 2005, and then it wasn't until 2018 when we were finally given a complete DVD box set. It is the DVD box set that I was waiting the longest time to own. Getting their start around the same time as Monty Python and coming from a shared background, the Goodies structured their show in a slightly less obtuse and more palatable way than the Pythons. The setup basically being it is a sitcom about 3 random blokes who run a company called the Goodies who will do any job that you hire them to do. The incredibly vague, loose and cartoony premise allowed them such creative freedom. You never knew what you were getting. So it is as weird as Monty Python, but they structured it as more accessible half-hour episodes with a consistent setup and characters running throughout the show. The fact they were so successful does not surprise me one bit, and even though a lot of its social satire relevant to the time, the visual humour and surreal nature of it means that while it does contain humour that has admittedly not aged well, it is still accessible today. And as my little tribute to Tim Brooke-Taylor, who tragically passed away recently, I'm going to run through my top 10 episodes. Rest in peace, Tim. Number 10. Lighthouse Keeping Loonies. Episodes of the Goodies are often in competition with each other for weirdest premise, and this one's definitely up there. So the Goodies take jobs as lighthouse keepers because Graham misread an advert for help wanted for a little light housekeeping. This setup slowly evolves over the course of the runtime into them striking oil underneath the lighthouse and launching it into space. Episodes like this encapsulate what I love so much about the Goodies: a silly random premise, the incredibly funny interplay between our 3 distinct characters, and some wonderfully weird and surreal and hilarious images.
Oh, the fish love it. Catch a whopper every time. You wait and see. Never fails.
Number 9. It Might As Well Be String. One of the Goodies' main comedy targets was advertising. They did their own fake ad breaks spoofing the adverts of the time. Being on the BBC, they didn't have to have real ad breaks, so that left them the freedom to present fake adverts that resembled actual adverts of the time and make it look like you're watching the commercial station before being hit with the punchline and surreal imagery. This episode came later in the series and brings their love of this target all into one episode, where the Goodies start an advertising agency who are hell-bent on violently marketing whatever product they're hired to sell to people, no matter the moral qualms. And they're so good at it that they manage to convince every single industry out there to stop buying any other product and replace literally everything with a universal commodity.
String. It has 1,000 uses. As a substitute for conventional electric wiring, it's safer and it's cheaper because it doesn't work.
Number 8. The Movies. The Goodies buy up a movie studio and attempt to revive the ailing British film industry. They were clearly all film buffs, because if you're an avid viewer of old art house movies like I am, you'll have a real appreciation for their reference points. You would have to be a fan of stuff like this to have the self-awareness needed to write about how outsiders would view slow, pretentious, bleak, arty movies.
What's this one? Death in Bognor.
Not this much.
No.
Come on, let's have the death then. Come on, you blighter, die! Come on, die!
But at the same time, this episode's also a proper send-up of how people will look at works of art and go, it's a load of rubbish, I could do better than that. But it shows what would happen if said people actually went ahead and tried to make movies with the intention of saying something deep and meaningful. Yes, some pretentious arty movies may seem shit and boring, but it's not as easy as it looks. Number 7. Gender education. It's more than likely that Mary Whitehouse, incredibly famous censorship campaigner making a lot of waves at the time, never really understood the Goodies. Maybe she just didn't notice all the drug references and violence because she inexplicably wrote to them to tell them how nice she thought their show was, which is weird. Like, did she just look at the title with the word good in it and think, ooh, that means it is good. Hooray for positive adjectives. The Goodies were naturally appalled by Whitehouse's endorsement of the show, and that inspired them to make this episode where Beryl Reid, playing an over-the-top caricature of Whitehouse, gets the Goodies to make a sex education film for schools, despite being so disgusted by the concept that she can't even say the word.
Now, we all know what a bad effect SE on screen has on people. And there is the script I've written for you. It's called How to Make Babies by Doing Dirty Things.
So obviously the Goodies take this request for a heavily censored sex education film to the extremest of extremes. A lot of the Goodies' reputation is built on basically being a live-action Looney Tunes cartoon, but they were also extremely sharp satirists, and most of the episodes driven by then current events stand out as some of the strongest in their catalogue. Number 6. Punky Business. The Goodies were subversive, but they always got pigeonholed as a child-friendly show, mostly because of the name and the cartoonish stylings of the outdoor set pieces. So when the punk movement came along in the late 70s, we got this episode of social satire, where they almost seem to find punk's explicit purpose of subverting societal expectations as cute posturing. They caricature the punk movement as just people doing and saying grimy and horrible things for the sake of it. And also, as is pointed out by Jane Ash's character, like any social trend, don't kid yourself, it's a business.
Punk is the latest in a long line of trends. 2, I get paid to write about trends, and if there weren't any new trends, I'd be out of a job. 3, there's a lot of loot in it.
Yeah, spitting harsh truths there, directly at a movement whose stated purpose is to spit harsh truths. The topic of this episode allows the Goodies to fully unleash. They were always anarchic, but this one gives them a reason to be a bit more twisted and violent than usual. And it's incredibly visually creative. I just love the massive safety pins across the entire head, and the ludicrous costumes at the punk ball. It's a downright hilarious cultural artifact that perfectly sends up the trend of the time. Number 5. The Baddies. The Goodies had a lot of big-name guest stars playing really solid, well-written characters, and they were always so good that they actually stopped getting them because they kept on getting the best lines. And none of those guest stars were better than in this episode where the second Doctor himself, Patrick Troughton, plays Dr. Wolfgang Adolphus Ratfink von Pettel, a cartoonishly evil mad scientist who's entered himself into the Nicest Person of the Year award, and who goes around sabotaging all his rivals. This is one of the most cartoony episodes in their catalogue, and it includes some great fourth wall breaking humour, and Patrick Troughton is so good in this.
I haven't a friend in the world, nobody to love me. Except my pet vulture, Lucretia. She only stays with me because she knows I've left her something in my will.
What have you left her?
Me.
Number 4. Kitten Kong. The Goodies' most iconic and enduring image is of a giant kitten climbing the post office tower. If you know of the Goodies at all, it's definitely through that image. Kitten Kong is visually stunning for a show made at the BBC in 1971. Considering how primitive special effects were at the time, it's amazing what they achieved with this one. It does what all the best Goodies episodes do. It starts out with a simple premise of the Goodies starting a veterinary business until Graham gets ideas above his station and events spiral out of control, and they give you narrative justifications for chucking you ludicrous images like a giant kitten climbing the post office tower. Kitten Kong is wonderful, and it's easy to see why it's gone on to be one of the most popular and fondly remembered episodes of the show.
Twinkle is still on the loose. Michael Aspel, BBC, London.
Number 3. Euthanasia. This here is the half hour of television that made me want to be a writer in the first place. This type of episode happened a couple of times throughout their history. It's the end of the production cycle, they got no money left for big elaborate outdoor set pieces, so let's just have an episode set entirely indoors with an ingeniously weird premise.
We interrupt our Christmas Eve carol service to bring you an important announcement. The world will end at 12 o'clock tonight.
It's a hoax.
This is not a hoax.
Not a hoax.
They use the oncoming apocalypse as a springboard to treat us to 30 minutes of what the Goodies would do if they only had an evening to live. And it's much more psychological than usual. I love the sequence where we explore Tim's strange hang-ups about his belly button, and his rather sweet-natured and innocent misconceptions about the world. Euthanasia is dark and nihilistic as well as being silly and offbeat, and it's hard to walk the fine line between those two extremes, but this one manages it beautifully. It's a hilarious 30-minute instalment where our characters have complete emotional breakdowns, and I still love every minute of it all these years later. Number 2. The End. Euthanasia and this one both lock our characters in the office all episode. I was blown away by both when I first saw them, and I saw The End second, so I might have had more affection for Euthanasia if it weren't for the fact this episode's reason for locking the goodies in the office all episode is much more solid. So Graham's now an architect, and he's working with a property developer on a series of tower blocks with an ingenious money-saving solution of having no rooms. They're just blocks of solid concrete. And one of the building sites is the goodies' office, and so they're accidentally encased in a block of solid concrete and are trapped inside for decades, go completely mad, and have to survive by eating the furniture. This one's incredibly relevant now that the world's stuck in lockdown. It's like this absurd little play about what could happen if you were stuck indoors for the rest of your life, can't even go out to get food. I'd recommend this one if you're getting cabin fever at the moment because it takes all those anxieties that you might be having about being stuck indoors to ludicrous extremes as the goodies go through complete emotional breakdowns and spiral out of control. It's hilarious and depressing, and its jokes land so hard it hurts.
As long as we got the old telly.
And finally, a service announcement. The BBC have announced a cutback of 100%.
Number 1. Radio goodies. Perfect is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and the reason I use it sparingly is because perfect is such a rare occurrence. Radio goodies is completely perfect from start to finish. A lot of it doesn't make immediate sense if you're not familiar with the context, but it is still accessible on the level of hyper-reality that the goodies operates on. I wasn't familiar with any of the context when I first watched it, and I still took it as read and loved it to bits because they wrote in such an accessible way that its jokes will still work without having to know specifically what it is that they're satirising. The episode is about the pirate radio industry of the time. Basically, radio stations such as the incredibly famous Radio Caroline would operate out in international waters. They were set up because the BBC wouldn't cater for their specialised tastes in music, and they had millions of listeners and were extremely popular. The goodies' attempt to set up an officially licensed radio station is foiled by an inadequate postal service, so Graham's idea is that they set up a pirate postal service operating out in international waters, which is such an ingeniously stupid idea that pretty much every joke that comes from the execution of that idea lands so hard every time I've watched it. Radio goodies is so weird, wonderful, and there's nothing else like it.
I've got this great new scheme for a pirate bus service, with bus stops all outside the 5-mile limit. They'll be mounted on rafts, look.
It truly is the Goodies Dead Parrot sketch. It's a demonstration of everything I love about not just the Goodies, but classic British comedy as a whole, and it deserves to be so much more well known than it is.